Cormac McCarthy was one of those unique creations. One of those where it seems like the mold was broken immediately after he showed just how determined, how driven, and how borderline mad of a being he was. In his struggling years as a young writer, he received offers to do lectures at universities, lectures that would provide much-needed money. Well, he declined the offer, stating that all he had to say was already on the page of his published books. And so, he continued writing, continued being poor, continued living on beans and water, and continued growing as a writer and as a human being. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, writing, and determination. I am your host, Jason Nemore Harden, proud to invite you to our 100th episode. Thank you for joining us as we explore Cormac McCarthy's debut novel, The Orchid Keeper. Quote, "The ugly fact is, books are made out of books. The novel depends for its life on the novels that have been written." End quote. Charles Joseph McCarthy Jr., the son of Joseph McCarthy and Gladys McGrail McCarthy, was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1933. He was raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, after his father moved the family there in 1937 to take a position as a lawyer with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is responsible for many of the physical and social changes that transformed the rural mountain region in the early 20th century. Now, the Tennessee Valley is where Cormac was first exposed to the people and the places that would occupy his southern works. The nickname Cormac, the Gaelic equivalent of Charles, was a family nickname given to his father by his Irish aunts, a tradition that he carried on. Now, in contrast to the wretched lives of his characters, it seems that Cormac's upbringing was quite a comfortable one, at least on the outside. He grew up in a large white house staffed with maids, considerable acreage, and a wooded area nearby. Later, he would state his family was considered rich because most of the people surrounding them lived in 1 or 2 bedroom shacks. What truth lies in that is up for debate. But what is not up for debate is how Knoxville, these shacks, and the unknown world that existed out there fueled young Cormac's imagination. The only novel of his that seems to have any autobiographical elements and exposes the McCarthy family dynamic to any degree is Suttree. In Suttree, there is a paralyzing father-son conflict. Cormac later admitted he wasn't what his parents had expected as he worked to discover his own identity. Further commenting on this discord with his parents, Cormac once said, "I felt early on I wasn't going to be a respectable citizen. I hated school from the day I set foot in it." Now, another vital element that would shape his writing was religion. He was raised a Roman Catholic, educated in Catholic schools until he entered the University of Tennessee in 1951, something that clearly resonates in his work. He was always active intellectually. He was not, however, a big reader in his early years, especially not fiction. That is not to say that he lacked hobbies. When his grammar school teacher asked if he had any interests, he realized not only that he seemed to be the only one in his class with hobbies, but also that he had every hobby imaginable. Name anything, no matter how esoteric, I had found it and dabbled in it. Except reading and writing, that was. Those interests would come later. Jump to 1955, 22 years old, stationed in Alaska with the U.S. Air Force. Ironically, it was there he discovered the great escape and beauty that books could provide. Now, to soothe the tedium in the barracks, he spent much of his spare time reading, discovering books that would pique his varied intellectual interests. "I read a lot of books very quickly," he would say, vague about which books left a deeper impression than others. One can nevertheless recognize certain writers in his writing, in particular William Faulkner, with his complex vocabulary, punctuation, ominous rhetoric, and use of dialect to shape his literary world. Cormac didn't dispute this influence. It's also been noted that his favorite book was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. It is widely believed that his classic novel, Blood Meridian, beckons with distinct echoes of Melville's classic. His list of good writers, which included the likes of Melville, Dostoevsky, and Faulkner, was quite simple in its criteria. Anyone who didn't deal with issues of life and death were excluded. He would go on to say, "To me, that's not literature. A lot of writers who are considered good are considered strange." Now, this is exactly what one might expect from such a writer as McCarthy. And so, after 2 years in the U.S. Air Force, after 2 years of reading, might I add, he returned to Knoxville and the University of Tennessee in 1957 to continue his degree in liberal arts. His intentions of finishing school were, however, derailed when he discovered his literary talents after winning the university's Ingram Merrill Award for creative writing. While still enrolled at the University of Tennessee, he published 2 stories, Wake for Susan and A Drowning Incident in the Phoenix, a student literary magazine, both published under the name C.J. McCarthy. However, upon discovering what he considered to be his path, he left the university without taking a degree to continue working on his first novel, The Orchid Keeper. Now, in later years, he distanced himself from Wake for Susan and A Drowning Incident, turning down the opportunity to have them reprinted in the Virginia Quarterly. Time did not soften his view of those early works, as years later he would reaffirm his strong stance, stating that he hoped to be long in the grave before they surfaced again. Early in his writing life, Cormac McCarthy renovated a dairy barn as a living space, salvaging bricks from the boyhood home of fellow Knoxville writer James Agee. And by this time, Agee had moved on from this plane of existence and most likely wouldn't mind the aspiring author putting the bricks from his childhood home to good use. Now, in building a new house from old stones, Cormac would mirror the ritual that would define his writing for the next 40 years. Now, in his many works, if not all, he selectively dismantled and reconfigured great landmarks of literary art. Out of the shards, he would create something distinctively his own. The Orchid Keeper follows a boy and 2 old men who weave in and out of his young life. Set in the Tennessee Hill Country, the elusive narrative memorializes without a trace of sentimentality a vanishing way of life in the woods. An affection for coonhounds binds the fate of the characters, who wander unaware of any kinship. The boy never learns that a decomposing body he sees in the leafy pit just may be his father. The story, however, similar to William Faulkner's literary style concerning its themes, characters, language, and structure, was far from a mere simple imitation. As stated, McCarthy began the book while in college and dropped out in order to dedicate himself more fully to it. He continued writing it in Chicago, where he worked part-time in an auto parts warehouse. "I never had any doubts about my abilities. I knew I could write. I just had to figure out how to eat while doing this." After 3 years of writing, he shipped the manuscript to Random House, seeing as it was the only publisher he had heard of. Eventually, it reached the desk of legendary editor Albert Erskine, who was William Faulkner's last editor, as well as the sponsor for Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry and The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, the latter being the topic of episode 96 of House of Words. Now, Erskine recognized Cormac as a writer of the same caliber as those he had collaborated with earlier in his career and would go on to edit McCarthy for the next 20 years. "There is a father-son feeling," Erskine would say, sheepishly adding that it felt this way despite the fact that they never managed to sell too many of his books. Now, The Orchid Keeper was published on May 5, 1965. Now, despite winning the William Faulkner Foundation Award for Notable First Novel, it would not propel him into stardom, nor sell in many great numbers. In spite of the lack of sales, however, it did provide McCarthy with grants. Grants from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the William Faulkner Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, having the ability to live on very little, he made the money from these grants sustain him for years to come. Cormac never showed any interest in a steady job, a trait that seems to have annoyed both his ex-wives. "We live in total poverty," his second ex-wife, Annie DeLissel, would once comment. For nearly 8 years, they lived in the reconstructed dairy barn outside Knoxville. "We were bathing in the lake," she added with some nostalgia. "Someone would call up and offer him $2,000 to come speak at a university about his books, and he would tell them that everything he had to say was there on the page, so we would eat beans for another week." He learned to survive on his own. He would cut his own hair. He ate his meals off a hot plate or at a cafeteria. He did his laundry at whatever laundromat was closest. For many of his first years, really decades, as a writer, he had no walls to hang anything on. Then, in 1981, at age 48, he heard the news that he was to receive the MacArthur Grant, also known as the Genius Grant. He was living in a motel in Knoxville, Tennessee at the time. Living from place to place, having no place to really call home, was the routine. That was the routine until 1982, when he bought a tiny whitewashed stone cottage behind a shopping center in El Paso, Texas. Well, in 1991, nearly a decade after buying this cottage, he told an interviewer that he wouldn't take him inside, seeing as renovations had stopped due to lack of funds. He claimed that it was barely habitable. In regards to Cormac McCarthy's style, he is not one to produce what one might consider easy reading, as he is not shy about presenting his readers with challenges, from applying unconventional narrative techniques to adding digressions, dream sequences, and using both interior and exterior monologues to keep the story churning. He continuously expects focus from his reader. He would have made Faulkner proud. Or so one might hope. Now, as for his writing, he was somewhat paradoxical in his approach, both working intensely and planning the elements of a story down to its most minute details in some works, while doing as little pre-planning as possible and letting the words channel through him on other works. One source claims that he would work on multiple projects at once and would dedicate hours to each project on a daily basis, working tirelessly as he wrote, reading vast amounts of books and philosophizing about themes. In an interview, he referred to Henry Miller and would, like Miller, sit down before his typewriter and patiently wait until his fingers began to move. Echoing what Henry Miller had said, that when in Paris he would sit before his typewriter and say, "Excuse me, my French speakers, j'écoute," meaning I listen or I am listening, then write as if he was taking dictation. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, McCarthy went further into detail concerning when outlines could be useful and when not, saying, "If you're writing mystery stories or something, you might want to have an outline, because it all has to have a logic and fall into place and have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But if you're writing a novel, the best things just sort of come out of the blue. It's a subconscious process. You don't really know what you're doing most of the time." Cormac wrote by hand, rising at 6 in the morning, every morning, 7 days a week, working until early afternoon. After the handwriting process, he then typed or had his words typed on the same typewriter he used for nearly 50 years. He used his Olivetti Latera 32 to write nearly all of his fiction, screenplays, and correspondence from 1960 to 2009. Well, the exact brand has been disputed, but we'll go with that. Then in 2009, the typewriter was auctioned by Christie's to benefit the Santa Fe Institute and was sold to an unidentified American collector for $254,500, more than 10 times its estimate. Now, a friend of McCarthy replaced the typewriter for him with a typewriter of the same exact model in a newer condition for the grand cost of $11. McCarthy would spend most of his adult life outside the ring of the campfire, refusing to be a part of the literary world taking place someplace in the distance. He refused to teach or dip his toe in journalism. He gave no readings or blurbs to a book and granted close to no interviews in the first few decades of his career. Early on, his novels never sold more than 5,000 copies in hardcover, and because of this, and maybe for other reasons as well, he never had an agent. He struggled, had little money, no money, could not afford toothpaste at one point, being temporarily relieved when he found a free sample in his mailbox. However, he kept doing what he felt he needed to do, what he enjoyed doing. He kept writing. And later, as I'm sure you know, he would find great success with The Road and even worked with the Coen brothers. But more on that later. For now, let's conclude this episode with a quote from the paradoxical recluse himself. Life is brief, and to have to spend every day of it doing what somebody else wants you to do is not the way to live it. End quote. Whether you've been hanging in with us for 100 episodes, or even if this is your first, it means everything to us. We're truly grateful. As usual, we hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/House of Words or paypal.me/House of Words podcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez, narrated and edited by me, Jason Nemore Harden, and music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.